Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first Encuentro Relief. We are honored and glad to present Dr. Charles Yang from the University of Pennsylvania. He's currently a professor of linguistics, computer science, and psychology, and director of the program in cognitive science at the University of Pennsylvania. His research interests relate to universal grammar, language acquisition, and numerical and conceptual development in children. Dr. Yang is a prominent linguist and has written several books, such as Knowledge and Learning in Natural Language, The Infinitive Gifts, The Price of Linguistic Productivity, How Children Learn to Break the Rules of Language. Thank you, Professor Yang, for giving us your insights about linguistics.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Shall we start with the first question? You kind of already answered it, but I think it's good. It's a good start point.
Okay. The question being the great milestones in the discipline,
yes,
challenges and the future. Again, I only do a very narrow part of linguistics, and so I can only comment on the area of linguistics I work in. Now, for me, the exciting turning point was the minimalist program, especially not just the technical apparatus of syntax, but the way Chomsky conceived the role of the language faculty in the general, more broad theory of mind and theory of cognition, the so-called interface conditions, the so-called constraints that must guide the development of language and how language interacts with other components. And of course, language learning is a very big component of that. Language is learned. And so I suppose I would just happen to be at the right place at the right time, and where there's a lot of developments within linguistics and within language acquisition had already taken place. We already knew a lot about child language. But there's still a missing component, really the component of learning that was not properly addressed in either linguistics or psychology, but very good theories of what language is. We have very good descriptions of what child language is at various stages, but we've had very little idea of how these stages develop. So I found this work to be interesting because it enabled us to borrow ideas, borrow insights from other disciplines, and then you, in turn, giving something back to the studies of cognition and perception. So for me, that has been the most interesting direction, and I hope to see more of that in the future.
Great. And another question was, what are the challenges in the area? Or it can be in your special area or in general linguistics.
Right. I think it's important not to lose sight of the goal of the enterprise. Sure, I mean, you can spend as much time as you want on the morpheme in a language, which is important, but also important to remember what's the study of that morpheme is for. It's really for general theory of language, contributing general theory of mind. But of course, people's interests differ. I mean, that's again, speaking from my own interest and the area of linguistics I happen to be engaged in. So in order to do so, I think we need to think a little more broadly. We need to read a little more broadly, and we need to have a healthy relationship with other fields and other disciplines, and while still recognizing the value of the traditional structural analysis of language, which is something we're good at, right? We can bring a lot to the table when we interact with psychologists and neuroscientists, computer scientists, and so We have a lot to offer, but at the same time, they have a lot to offer to us as well. I think that's the main challenge, and this is reflected in some of my own experience working with researchers in slightly different fields. You really need to understand what they're doing, put yourself in your own shoes, and find a common ground you can work with. So that I think would be some of the main challenges, especially as the field of linguistics begins to engage, I suppose, more widely than before.
Right. And which are the trending topics in the area, according to you? If
right, well, that's very hard to say. Predicting the future is always hard. I frankly don't know. I'm really just pursuing my own interests and see how and keep an eye on how my own research area develops and how other fields develop in relation to language and linguistics. It's very hard to know for sure. There are very general trends that are happening out there, and they inevitably will have an impact on linguistics. For instance, big data, machine learning, and we all have to develop an appropriate understanding of these more general trends and see how they impact our own work and own thinking.
I think the following question you kind of answered to. Which topics do you consider should be investigated in the next 10 years?
Right. No, that's, again, I think that's a very personal choice. And I think maybe at least for students, I think is you do what you're good at, I suppose.
Okay. What advice would you give to someone who is starting out on linguistic research? Someone who is initiating in linguistics?
Right. Again, that's quite personal of a question, right? I think being able to think about science, think about language, think about linguistics in this world is really a luxury. So we should do something we enjoy. So I suppose the advice would be do what you enjoy doing within the field of linguistics, even when that may not be a very popular topic, but at least it's something you should feel passionate about.
Great. And last, what are the contributions of a linguist to society, in your opinion?
Right.
There is any.
That's even harder to answer. Yeah, I never really thought about this. I suppose there's inherent value in doing science, in gaining understanding, in accumulating knowledge. For lots of other, and the science you develop may have implications. For instance, it may help people understand, say, for instance, various developmental disorder when it comes to language. And it's also possible to connect the science of language to engineering applications, for instance, natural language processing, even though that hasn't been done so much. But I retain hope that can be done one day. Also social changes, right? Social conditioning of languages and their speakers. All of these are very lively issues. So we can make our contributions in different ways. And that's very much like what I mentioned earlier. It's very often, it should be obvious, but if you want to make a contribution to some other aspect of society, or just like in some other adjacent fields, you have to embed yourself in those issues deeply to understand what are the current concerns, and then you can probably bring your work more sharply into relevance. So otherwise, you're just talking about this in the abstract.
And we wanted to know, like an extra, what are you working on right now, or what are your plans for the future, if you have some goal in mind or something like that?
Right. What am I doing? One direction I'm looking at now is, again, going back to the traditional problem for explanatory adequacy. How did a child learn a language? The answer would have to be some combination of innate structures of language, and by which I mean quite broadly including other innate structures of other cognitive or perceptual systems, and a learning component and learning process that get children to where they need to go in their particular linguistic environment. So it's going to be naturally a division of labor between the two aspects, and we won't know for sure, or we won't even have a clear picture without articulating exactly what we think is innate building and exactly what we think the learning component is. Once we articulate those two components clearly, we can talk about the division of labor. We can talk about whether some end result of language is a result of the reflex of some pre-existing structure, or the result of language learning. So when we look at linguistic analysis, when you have some generalization that you wish your theory to capture, you need to know if that generalization is really what Chomsky calls the first factor, or the second and the third factor. So that's an area I find interesting. I'm trying to explore in this space in different components of the theory of language. I'm also beginning to develop some projects in connecting the science of language learning to more engineering-oriented applied problems. But that's a long game, right? And it'll take a while to see any, concrete results.
Well, thanks a lot. I don't know if Nadia wants to say something, or if you want to say something else, but we really appreciate everything you said. And I think the people at Encuentro will appreciate it too. So we are really, really thankful for your insights.
Thank you.
Yes, we are really thankful. Can I add one more question?
Of course, yeah.
So you were saying that you're currently working on understanding language acquisition. And do you think that understanding language acquisition and how language faculty works can shed light on other cognitive aspects, as, I don't know, numerical cognition and conceptual? Yes, and that's my question.
Right. Yeah, I'm interested in that. I think a lot of people have this idea that language is what makes us smart, right, as opposed to other species, including those that are very related to us. So almost as thinking this as engineers, you want to know exactly how language makes us smart. It's easy to say that. So you just need to find some empirical cases where significant changes in the conceptual system of the child can be traced back to their linguistic development, and then, which we in turn calls a series theory of linguistic development. So that's an area that I find interesting because, first of all, it's a very important question. Second, it has to do with the mechanics of learning and development, and that's what I do. So it may not be able to, it may go into a dead end or may not be right, but at least you're in a position of saying something concrete, and then we can test the predictions. So that's an area I found interesting. And there's a lot, of course, people have been thinking about this, since Aristotle to this day, so those are questions that have always been important. I think probably a lot of us got into linguistics because we were excited by these questions. But then, of course, once you become a linguist, you do your daily stuff, your analysis of morphemes, for instance, or grammatical constructions. Occasionally, it's interesting to think about this more, general problems, I think.
Well, thank you very much for your answer and for your time. And I don't know if Marisol wants to add anything else, but
no, nothing. Just no, nothing else.
Great. Well, thanks for having me.
Thank you.